everyone, and welcome to another episode of Seed Speaks. My name is Alex Martin, and I am the editor of Seed World magazine. And today I am so happy to be your host. Last week, we got to hear from my coworker, Mark Zinkowitz, who talked a little bit more about how breeders are receiving funding for their projects. This week, we're kind of taking a different turn to look at something a little bit different, which is how breeders keep in mind their specific audiences while they're breeding. To help us discuss more, I'd like to introduce our two panelists of the day. Erwin Goldman, who's a professor in the Department of Horticulture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Lindsay Wyatt, who is a plant breeder with Johnny's Selected Seeds. So thank you so much, Erwin and Lindsay, for joining us. I'd like to start with some brief introductions. And Erwin, we're going to start with you today. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your research?
Well, thanks, Alex, and thanks so much for including me and including us today on this program. You know, I've been breeding vegetable crops here at the University of Wisconsin in Madison for 31 years, and I'm breeding cross-pollinated vegetable crops, in particular carrot, onion, and table beet. I came here with an interest in working on vegetable crops and working on traits that were important to farmers and gardeners and consumers. And I have I've had for the last 45 years or so, a really strong interest in biology, in genetics, and in evolution. I did my my schooling at the University of Illinois, at North Carolina State, and at the University of Wisconsin. And it has just been an enormous pleasure and privilege for me to do public plant breeding here for all these years.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erwin. And we'll pivot right now over to Lindsay. Lindsay, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of the work that you do with Johnny's.
Yeah, hello. Thanks so much for having me today. So my name is Lindsay. I work at Johnny's Selected Seeds as the squash and pumpkin breeder. So I work on summer squash, winter squash, and pumpkins, all different sorts of all three of those in my role. So we're based in Maine. And I have been at Johnny's for about 8 years. And before that, I got my PhD in plant breeding and genetics at Cornell.
That is fantastic. Well, thank you so much to both of you for those introductions. Let's go ahead and dive into some questions today. I'm starting off a little bit interesting today. I actually want to start with a question for both of you. It's kind of a fun, imaginative question. When you're working in terms of breeding, who do you picture as your audience? Maybe we'll start with Erwin and then pivot over to Lindsay and we'll continue the order we had. But Erwin, who do you think of when you are picturing your breeding audience?
Well, first of all, I have to say I love the question, Alex, because it's, you know, to think of it as an audience, it sort of makes me think of plant breeding as a kind of a performance in a way, which I think it is. I always joke that plant breeding is the slowest of the performing arts, but in some ways, I do feel like we're unraveling over a very long period of time this product. And so who is the end user? Who is the audience for this product? For me, in the public plant breeding sector, is a pretty wide range of characters, a pretty big cast of characters, which includes obviously the farmers and gardeners of the state and of any of the states, and I should say beyond the United States, people who grow this crop. I'm one of the few people breeding these crops in the public sector, and so the kinds of public germplasm we can create has the potential to grow all over the world. So sometimes I'm thinking about farmers and gardeners who would be growing this in any, maybe let's say, temperate environment. But I also think a lot about the folks who would be doing it in Wisconsin, which is one of the reasons why I'm trying to test and screen in environments across the state here, so at least I have a sense for what does well. But beyond the farmers and gardeners, I've thought a lot about consumers. And I would say that that's probably one of the biggest regular draws on my attention span with respect to the end user or the audience. Who is going to eat this thing? And what are they eating it for? What are they eating it with? How do they prepare it? What are they looking for? I just had an occasion to meet a gentleman in a casual encounter who didn't know what my job was, who told me that he juices beets every morning and drinks beet juice. So I'm thinking a lot about the people who are out there eating the crop.
Yeah, that is absolutely perfect. Thank you so much, Erwin. Lindsay, I'm sure you have a very similar audience in mind, but I'd love to hear who you're picturing of when you are working in breeding as well, especially as a squash and pumpkin breeder.
Yeah,
What's
so I have a lot in common with Erwin in terms of audience, although I guess it's kind of nice because I know exactly who my audience is in a lot of cases because we know who is buying our seeds. Um, Not that I go through that data all the time, but generally at Johnny's, we consider our core customer to be advanced home gardeners and mixed market growers. So people who sell things at CSAs, through CSAs or at farmers markets. And so that's really what I focus on. We do sell to a lot of other people. But that's kind of our core focus when we think about making our selections and designing our breeding targets. And just like Erwin, I do make sure to picture my audience all the way through the supply chain. So to the person actually eating the product, or I guess putting it on their porch in the case of jack-o'-lanterns. And that is really easy because of our company model where the people buying the seed and growing it are either the ones eating it themselves or are usually only one or two steps away from the people eating it, which I really appreciate about my job.
Sure, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially like you said. I didn't even think to focus on the growers who might be selling, particularly at farmers market. It's a different realm than I usually think of.
Mhm.
That is absolutely fantastic. Now, Erwin, you are coming to us, as you mentioned, with a bit of a different experience as a public plant breeder. And I think you kind of already hit on some of these differences that you're seeing in your audience. But what are some of the biggest differences you see in terms of a public plant breeding audience?
Yeah. One of the things that I keep in mind, and I think this is true for many of my colleagues in the public sector, that we're essentially put in place by the people of the state. It's true that my salary and the salaries of my colleagues are paid partly probably by tuition and partly by state revenues, but we we work for the people. And in that sense, I feel an obligation to breed for and at least connect with the wide variety of operations that exist in the state. So, if let's say for when we're talking about vegetable crops, we've got small market gardeners like Lindsay was just speaking of. We've got organic, we've got conventional, we've got large, we have a very large processing industry in Wisconsin that grows thousands of acres of vegetable crops for canning and other kinds of processing. So, I guess in answer to your question, Alex, it's the interest in and I guess willingness to pay attention to that full spectrum of clientele, and that my program, because there aren't many programs like it, needs to serve a wide variety of constituents.
No, perfect. Thank you so much. And Lindsay, you mentioned as well having quite a unique audience. You mentioned it ranges from home gardeners to maybe gardeners who want to eat their own vegetables to gardeners who are selling at the local farmers market. And then you took that a step further and said you're also thinking about the consumer. How do you keep all of those audience members kind of straight in your head as you're breeding to hit everything that they might want in a variety?
Yeah, great question. It can be hard sometimes, but I think my biggest strategy is just being lucky enough to be a part of the system that I'm breeding for. So I like to go to the farmers markets. I've been a CSA member. I know what it's like to be the consumer on that end, and I'm directly interacting with the growers who are selling their produce that way. And I do home gardening, and am able to experience that sort of thing. I like to eat at restaurants to source local produce, and I like to cook my squash. And just being able to be part of that system really helps me kind of always have that internalized as I'm working. But also, I need to acknowledge, and I try to remind myself that it's impossible sometimes to breed something that'll be perfect for everyone in that system. So then I have to decide for any particular project, what is my target. Am I making something that's optimized for the grower but might not taste quite as good for the end consumer, or vice versa? And we have to kind of pick and choose sometimes.
Yeah, that's a lot to balance in one variety, and I'm sure even sometimes while you're breeding, things can go differently than what you're imagining them to be. So it's quite the it's quite difficult. I imagine sometimes. Erwin, what is the biggest drive for you when you're working on your research projects? Is it particularly audience driven, or is it need driven, or are you kind of just focusing on things that interest you?
Yeah, probably. That's a great question. Probably some of all of those things. I would say that a big factor is, and I don't mean to sound glib about this, but to some extent, we have to do what we can get funded to do. So the work that I do is usually the result of a grant project that maybe I've written the grant proposal or a colleague has written the grant proposal. So to some extent, those grant proposals are funded by public agencies like the United States Department of Agriculture, and that does reflect public priorities. So I guess the best of all possible worlds is where something that I'm interested in about how plants work or a trait that I'm interested in fits with a public priority that I can write a grant for and get funds to hire people to and buy supplies to do the work. But I spend also a lot of time, like my colleagues do, and I'm sure this is true for Lindsay too, is listening to the people that grow and consume the crop and listen to the things that they want. So I hope that I'm also doing things that are priorities for those folks, because that's really, that's the audience, that's the end user, and I want to make sure that some of the things that I'm working on, hopefully a lot of the things I'm working on, will lead to good outcomes for them.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And we're going to come back to that listening to your audience soon, because I know we have a audience question waiting, but I'm not quite ready to get to it yet. Um, Lindsay, before we go over that kind of in that direction, when you're working with your audience in mind, what does that mean you're targeting in terms of plant breeding? Because you mentioned there could be some times where you're targeting it for a farmer instead of the consumer, or you're targeting it to taste good, and it might not be, maybe performing the best. How do you kind of keep those targets in mind with your audience?
Yeah, so I first tend to focus on kind of a core required level of traits. So things like yield, disease resistance, vigor, and something that I kind of generally think of as making our crops easy to grow. So at Johnny's, the people growing our crops are usually not specialists. So it's not someone just growing, hundreds of acres of one crop. It's someone growing, 20 different types of vegetables, whether it's in their home garden or on their CSA farm. So I really want my squash to be easy to grow and vigorous and not fussy, basically. And so that's kind of where I start, along with good eating quality. So that's something that's kind of a company value at Johnny's. So we do a lot of taste testing towards that result, and really just have some standards for that. Another thing that I think of, especially with our CSA and farmers market customers in mind, is breeding visually distinct varieties. So if it's, for example, um, we have like our Starry Night acorn squash we released a few years ago. So it has this variegated yellow and green rind pattern. And so the idea with that is that, people can come back to the farmer's market week after week or year after year and say, that's the one I bought. I can recognize it because it looks, unique and it tasted really good, and I'm going to buy it again. And we have seen that playing out with some of our trial partners, which is really exciting to hear that people like what we're releasing and want to buy it again.
Yeah, no, that is super exciting to have that kind of visual appeal as well, to make people really recognize it when they see it out in the market. Um, Erwin, kind of a similar question to you, but how do you keep both of your audience and your goals in mind when you're working in public breeding? Like, do you have some flexibility open for when things might turn out a little bit differently than you imagined?
I think so. I think everybody at the university recognizes the long-term trajectory of plant breeding, and you might start out with a particular set of objectives, and the plants and the way selection proceeds might be different. I think that as long as we can show that we're being responsive and productive in each season, plant breeding being such a cyclical process, in any given season that we're trialing in a wide variety of locations, that we're growing a lot of plots, making a lot of crosses, I think we're fulfilling at least the basic objectives. If we can have success with producing wonderful varieties or useful germplasm, fantastic. And I hope we can do that. But I do think that there's an understanding of the nature of the field. And in this sense, maybe compared to Lindsay's job in a private company where their bottom line is selling seeds, in my case, it might be a little different. I am also training students, and I'm also working in a trainee kind of mentor-mentee role. And so the pressure may be a little bit different, if that makes sense.
No, I think that does make sense, Erwin.
Mm-hmm.
You get to teach the next generation plant breeders, and I think with that could come some mistakes along the way, or some happy accidents, as Bob Ross would say.
Exactly.
In breeding.
Exactly.
Let's see. I think this is now where I'd like to bring in our next audience question. I think we had a slight technical issue where Lindsay will be right back. So I'm going to start by posing this question to you, Erwin.
Sure.
How can a farmer or a consumer share what they want in varieties to plant breeders? You mentioned listening to your audience a bit. So how do you get that feedback from growers?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Ashley. Thank you for asking that. There's a wide variety of ways. I mean, one of the most traditional ways would be going to field days, participating in field days where farmers might come to a field and see some of the stuff we're working on, or maybe it's at a research station. I think all the public breeders, usually have trials going on at research stations that have field days where, farmers will come, gardeners will come, and you'll look through the plots together and they'll say, I like this, or can you change that? So that's a kind of a traditional way. But increasingly, we text each other, we talk on the phone, we meet at other kinds of events. Is in recent years, as I've gotten more involved with the culinary community, chefs and other food professionals, we meet at dinners, we meet at events. And it is those conversations that really inform the work that we're doing. And so I would say there's a huge variety of formal and informal channels for that information to get to me. And maybe one of the most effective is people getting my number off of my webpage and sending me a text message. Hey, can we talk about carrots? And I love those conversations.
I love that you brought in kind of that informal aspect as well, because I think everyone would think about the formal aspects. Lindsay, welcome back. I would love to get your take on this question as well. So this is a question from our audience member. How can a farmer or a consumer share what they want to see in varieties to plant breeders?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and an important one. So I think the easiest way to get feedback straight to me is emailing the Johnny's customer support line. So if someone comments about something they would like to see in a squash, or how one of our current varieties is doing and what could be better about it, I see that information. And yeah, I think that's the most direct way. We also have territory sales representatives at Johnny's who develop relationships with our customers, and so they are really helpful in passing feedback along to the breeders at Johnny's.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I have about 2 more questions for you, I think. But for both of you, what would your recommendation be for a plant breeder that might be having a hard time picturing their audience? Maybe this is a newer plant breeder that just hasn't figured out the best way to picture it. What is the best way to keep that particular person in mind? Maybe Lindsay, we'll start with you this time since we've been starting with Erwin.
Yeah, so I think I would repeat some of what I said before, which is just try and meet people who are your target audience and immerse yourself in that world as much as you can. And the other thing that I am finding really helpful for myself as a relatively new breeder still is writing kind of a target profile when I have a new breeding objective. So I just did this the other day with a new thing we're going to start working on. And, then you can really sit and think about what your customer needs and then write out all of the traits, like the yield needs to meet or exceed this variety, and it needs to taste good, and so forth. And then having that all spelled out when you have kind of some time and breathing room in the winter can be really helpful to have on hand when you're making decisions and are in kind of rush mode in the summer and fall.
Oh, I love that. That's perfect for our audience who is a bit more focused on organization. Writing it out sometimes can definitely help. Erwin, what about you? What would your recommendation be for a plant breeder having a hard time keeping that audience in mind?
Yeah, I love Lindsay's suggestion, because if you know where you want to go, you'll have a chance to get there. So I think that's a really smart idea. And I suppose, it's some of this depends on personality. If you're the kind of person who likes to walk up to somebody at the grocery store or at the farmer's market and say, what makes you interested in that squash? What are you looking for? I mean, those conversations can be a lot of fun, but not everybody wants to have them necessarily. So it might be going to more formal kinds of things. And we have, for example, here in Madison, we have a huge garden expo that takes place in February, where everybody that's interested in seeds and crops and all that comes out, and it happens over multiple days. A place like that is a collection point for people who are passionate about these things. And I think a plant breeder could get a lot of mileage out of participating in some of the programming that is around those kinds of events wherever they live, because they're going to get a huge variety of opinions on things. And that's, let's face it, a lot of this is about having conversations.
Oh, I think that's perfect. You got to be brave sometimes as a plant breeder if you want to go collect that feedback. And final question, I think, for both of you before we wrap up for the day. We've established that a lot of us are working on breeding to a similar audience. For example, Erwin, you and Lindsay
Mhm.
overlap a little bit in your audience. How do
Mhm.
you both stay creative when you're working to similar audiences and growers? Erwin, maybe we'll start with you this time and we'll let Lindsay take the final word for the day.
Well, I have to say that plant breeding has a built-in advantage. It is, to me, one of the most compelling things I could ever imagine doing. And so I cannot wait every morning to get out there. I love it. I've known so many plant breeders who feel that way about it. Some of it is just the beauty of, looking at this variation of material. Some of it's the wonderful thing about being involved in the cyclical nature of our crops. So I think for me, it's sort of there's a bit of a built-in advantage, but I do think that the more you look at variation and the more you talk to people about what they're interested, the more involved you are in trying to capture that variation and put it in the package of a variety, or to introgress an interesting trait. So I feel like it all builds on itself. The more engaged you are and will be. And so I feel like that you reap what you sow in that sense.
Absolutely. I think that's wonderful. And Lindsay, we will give you the final word of the day.
Yeah, I totally agree with Erwin. People who are plant breeders, I find, really love what they do and they love their crops. That's definitely the case for me. And
Mhm.
so it's pretty easy to be creative and excited about what I'm doing. And working on squash and pumpkins is even easier because there's such a huge diversity of shapes and sizes and colors and flavors that I really get to do a lot of different things, and that's really fun. And I think it's also important to remember that even if, two plant breeders have the same general audience and are working on the same crop, usually they're going to be in different locations. So even if you develop the same thing coincidentally, it might be better adapted for different customers and growers. And so, really, I think we're all working together to really make our food system stronger, which is really fun.
think that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you. That is all the time we have today. I hope everyone in our audience has learned something. I think you could just feel how passionate both of you are about plant breeding. And so hopefully they got to take something home that they can talk about at their dinner table later tonight. But if you liked this topic, make sure you tune in next week. We'll be pivoting a little bit away from the world of vegetable breeding and into more of a row crop world where Ashley Robinson is going to be diving into the realm of trait stacking and breeding. So it should be really fun. Thank you so much all, and we'll see you all next week.